Hello learners, are you interested in pursuing a career in environmental health and management or occupational health and safety? Here is a program for you. IGNOU launches a new program, a postgraduate diploma in environmental and occupational health. This program is a postgraduate diploma program with 40 credits and the medium of instruction is in English. The minimum duration for completion of this program is 1 year and it can also be completed in a maximum of 3 years. The target group for this program would be professionals who are working in the environmental and the occupational sector, in non-governmental organizations, employees who are working in the industrial setup, in the occupational sector, and
Hello learners, I am Professor Bhardwaj from School of Engineering and Technology, and today I'll discuss with you about disaster management. So let us begin our discussion with this graphics. Just look at this graphics. You might have seen some of the events or come across or heard about these events like tornado, then flood, storm, then wildfire, earthquake, drought, tsunami, landslide, typhoon, volcano, ice storm, sinkhole. These are some of the events that you find in the nature. And these events may turn into a disaster if the magnitude of these events exceed the capability or ability of a society to cope with the effect of these events. So, first of all, I have given you a hint that what is disaster basically. The disaster is an event in which the magnitude of that event is such that it exceeds the capability or ability of a society or community to cope with the effect of that event basically. So if this happens, then any event, whether it is natural, man-made or hybrid, this may be called as disaster. So let us begin with what are the formal definitions of disaster. From academic point of view, disaster may be defined in various ways. We will discuss only some important definitions, and in this way our first definition comes from United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, UNISDR. In 2009, United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction gave definition for disaster as: disaster can be defined as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, economic or environmental losses and impacts. So it is encompassing many things. First of all, widespread human, material, economic or environmental losses and impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. Means here we are restricting that no external aid is there. When external aids come into the picture, then this event will become certainly disaster. So if a society or a community is able or capable to cope with the effects of an event with its own resources, then it is simple event. But when it is not able to cope with that event with its own resources, and the impact is such that widespread loss of human life, material, economic activities, and even the loss to the environment basically is there, then it becomes a disaster basically. So this is the definition from United Nations. Then there is one important definition that is given by the Disaster Management Act of India. Disaster Management Act of India says that disaster is a catastrophe, mishap, calamity or grave occurrence in any area arising from natural or man-made cause or by accident or negligence. These are the things that it's a catastrophe, mishap, calamity or grave occurrence in any area. Arising from where? Arising from natural or man-made cause. It may be natural or man-made, or by accident or negligence also, which result in substantial loss of life or human suffering or damage to and destruction of property or damage to or degradation of environment, and is of such nature or magnitude as to be beyond the coping capacity of the community of the affected area. Again, the criteria is the coping capacity or capability of the affected community or the society. That is the main criteria here. That whether that community or society is able to cope with the effect of that event or not. If it is able, then it is simple event. If it is not able to cope with that effect of that event, then it becomes disaster. So this is the fine difference between an event and disaster. An event can turn into disaster if the affected society or community is not able to cope with the effect of the event with its own resources and safely. That is the difference between an event and a disaster basically. Now, what is the criteria to classify an event as disaster? There are many criteria. First of all, the scope and severity of impact. In this scope and severity of impact, we count first of all the loss of life and human suffering. If the loss of life and human sufferings are at large scale, then that event will be classified as a disaster. Significant of loss of life is there. Significant number of persons are injured. Then if there is a widespread human suffering in many ways, like spread of disease, no availability of food, no availability of water, no availability of shelter, no availability of clothing, so many things, so many sufferings basically. Even that mental trauma. So many things are included in this. Then second is damage to infrastructure and property. Here the key indicators are extensive damage to infrastructure. Infrastructure in the sense that your transportation network, your communication network, your power supply network, then medical facilities are affected, then damage to property, damage of houses, damage of buildings, then essential services like interruption to water supply, interruption to sanitation, interruption to power supply, communication. So if these all things are affected and at a large scale, then that event will be classified as disaster. Then economic disruptions. Because of an event, there may be economic disruptions in the society. There may be hindrances in businesses, hindrances in services, hindrances in farming activity. So many things basically which affect the economic activities basically. If this economic activity disruption is at large scale, then that event will be classified as disaster. The next is environmental degradation or damage. Environment is very important to us because we live in the environment. We breathe in the environment. We take water from environment. So many things, we are dependent on the environment. If our environment is contaminated, degraded or polluted, then also there is a disruption to the life. So this is also one of the important criteria for classification of an event as disaster. If a widespread damage or impact on the environment is there due to some event, then that event will be classified as disaster. Then in both the definitions you have seen there the coping capability, ability to cope with the effect of the disasters. So this is one of the criteria also. That event has occurred. Then, okay, many impacts are there. But if the society or community is able to cope with these effects, then it is a simple event. But if the community or the society is not able to cope with the impacts of that event, that will be classified as disaster. So here, this capacity of the community or the society is also one of the criteria to classify an event as disaster. So what happens? What are the things here that are counted? Whether the local resources are exhausted or not. If a community or society is able to cope with the impact of that event with its own resources, then it is simply event. But if the local resources are exhausted and the community or the society is not able to cope with the impact of that event and it needs some external aid, then that event will be classified as a disaster. For example, if there is an earthquake of magnitude of 3.5, then its impact will be very small. People will feel the vibrations. People will feel that buildings are vibrating, their beds are vibrating, and they may get a fear basically in their mind for their safety. But nothing will be there like a structural damage to injury to some person. So nothing will be there. So at the magnitude of 3, that earthquake is an event. It is not a disaster. But if an earthquake event occur with a magnitude of something 6 or more, then there will be damage to the structures, damage to the property, damage to the infrastructure. There may be some houses collapse. Then because of that there will be injury. There may be some fatal injuries, some death, casualties may be there. So the earthquake event at magnitude of 6, which is causing widespread damage to the infrastructure, property, and the loss to the life, basically, that becomes disaster. So both are earthquake events. But here the magnitude of earthquake made a difference on the impact of earthquake on the community or the society. And earthquake event of magnitude 2.5 or 3 was an seismic event, earthquake event. But the earthquake event at the magnitude of 6, it was a disaster. So that is the difference between that event and disaster. Then need for external assistance. As I just told you that this is an extension of that previous point, basically, that local resources exhausted. If the local resources are exhausted, then certainly we will need for external assistance to face that event. And if such situation comes, then that event becomes a disaster, basically. Then another point that is considered in this exceeding local capacity is disruption of normal functioning. That a disaster disrupts the normal functioning of a community or society. If such thing happens during an event, then that event will be classified as a disaster. That people are not able to go for their work, people are not able to lead their normal life, people are not able to do their businesses or services. So then that event will be disaster, basically. The next is type of events. The events may be of different types. Basically, we classify generally into 4 categories. These events are classified into 4 categories. First one is natural disaster. Second one is technological disaster. Third one is man-made disaster. And fourth one is hybrid disaster. Hybrid disaster means when a interaction of natural and technological disaster or man-made disaster is there. So it will be a hybrid disaster. So you know that natural disasters are caused by the natural forces, means which occur naturally. No intervention of human being, no technological intervention, nothing. Human being is not doing anything in this case. Whatever is happening, it is happening because of nature. It is occurring naturally, basically. And you know, so many events, so many natural activities which may turn into disaster. Like floods, like earthquake, like cyclones, like drought. So many things, so many natural activities, basically, which occurs in nature. But if the magnitude of these natural activities exceeds the coping capability of the society or the community, then these are natural disasters, like landslide. Next is technological disasters. In the category of technological disasters, we count industrial accidents like Bhopal gas tragedy. If you remember, in Bhopal, there was accident in a pesticide factory, basically, in which methyl isocyanate gas was leaked, and around 2000 people died, and thousands of people suffered for their whole life because of many health problems because of that exposure to that methyl isocyanate gas, which this accident occurred in 1984 in Bhopal. Likewise, there was nuclear power plant explosion or accident in Chernobyl in Ukraine in 1986, basically, which caused widespread exposure to the radioactive rays, and which affected many people. Likewise, there was in Turkey in 2014, there was some Soma mine disaster in which around 800 people died. So there are so many industrial accidents are there. These are some big accidents basically. Otherwise, in factories or in companies, basically, these accidents generally happen, and they are injuries or casualties to the workers there. But we are counting here the disasters, basically, not the simple accidents. Then there were examples of chemical spills. There are examples of other explosions also, worldwide, basically. Then another type is man-made disasters. In man-made disasters, basically we count importantly as terrorism, warfare, war between communities at large scale, war between countries, world war. So these are basically disasters in which a large population is affected. So these become as disasters to the community or the society. Then hybrid disasters. In hybrid disasters, basically, we classify those disasters which are interaction of the two different type of disasters, like natural disaster and technological disaster, then natural and man-made. So, for example, in Japan, a atomic power plant was destroyed because of tsunami. So tsunami was a natural disaster, but it struck that power plant. So that technological disaster, because that power plant was the example of technology basically. So it caused the failure of that power plant and large population was affected. So this becomes a hybrid disaster. So these are four categories of different type of disasters, basically. Means four categories or classification in which the different disasters are classified. Now, let us see some examples of events that could be classified as disasters. First of all, a severe earthquake causing widespread destruction and loss of life. As I explained you that if there is an earthquake of higher magnitude, then it will cause a widespread loss to the infrastructure, property, and also loss to the life. Then a major flood that inundates a large area, displacing populations and damaging infrastructure. If there is some dam break, then there will be a large area will be submerged, and it will affect the population and as well as the farming activities, economic activities, industrial activities, and damage to the infrastructure also. Then a disease outbreak that overwhelms the healthcare system and leads to a high number of deaths. You are having recent memories of COVID, because of which the whole world was paralyzed. Not a community, not a society, not a country, but the whole world was affected by that. This is the biggest example. So many epidemic events had been in the past also, because of which the large part of our world was affected. And in the recent memories, effect of COVID is there, which put on halt everything, be it is a business, be it is a service, be it is a life, everything was halted. Every normal activities was stopped. So this is a disaster basically. Then a chemical plant explosion causing widespread damage and environmental contamination. I gave you two examples. Bhopal gas tragedy in 1984. Another one, Chernobyl power plant explosion in Ukraine in 1986. So these are some of the examples of that explosion in the factories or plants. Then protracted famine affected a large population. These are earthquake, floods, chemical explosion. In addition to that, one very important and very silent event where you will not see many people shouting, crying, is a famine. If there is some drought is there in some area, no agricultural activity is possible in that case. Nothing is produced. That area is affected badly because there is nothing to eat. And if such famines occur year by year, then it becomes a great disaster. In our country, Bengal famine is, Odisha famine is very famous disasters basically. So these are some activities which or events which can be classified as disaster. Now, if we talk about that biomedical things or health system, the Center for Research on Epidemiology of Disasters, CRAD, considers at least one of the following criteria to classify an event as a disaster. What are these criteria? There are 4 criteria given by CRAD. If the death of persons is 10 or more is there, then that event will be classified as a disaster. If the number of affected people are more than 100, then that event will be classified as disaster. If a country has to make a call for international assistance, if a community or society or a country needs international assistance to tackle with that event, then it will be called as disaster. If a state emergency is declared to deal with that event, then it will be called as a disaster. If out of these four, any one of that criteria is met, then that event will be classified as a disaster. So this is the criteria given by CRAD, which is the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, basically. So this is related to the biological disasters. Then after discussing about that, what is disaster, what is the criteria to classify an event as disaster, now let us move to the disaster management. How to manage the disasters, basically. What is disaster management? So disaster management is the process of preparing for and responding to disasters. That whenever there is a disaster, how prepared we are, how we can prepare for a disaster, and how we can respond to that disaster. That process is disaster management. So there are two aspects. First is preparation, means preparedness for a disaster, which is a pre-disaster phase, and responding to the disaster, which is a during disaster and post-disaster. So these are the two things basically in disaster management. That before the disaster, what we have done, how we have planned, how much ready we are. And based on that preparedness, it will depend that how you face the disaster. So these are the two things basically in the disaster management. Disaster management involves organizing resources to reduce the impact of disasters on people and property. That what is the aim? That we have to reduce the impact of disaster on the human and the property. Because there are two concerns, human life and property. So to reduce the impact on the human life and the property, whatever we are doing, whatever steps we are taking, whether it is pre-disaster stage or during the disaster or post-disaster stage, all those activities, all those processes, all those our actions comes under the umbrella of disaster management. Then what are the goals of disaster management? What do we want to achieve by this disaster management? By disaster management, we want to safeguard the lives and property first. As it was clear in the definition that there were two aspects, human life and the property. So here the goal is to safeguard the lives and the property. Second is to reduce loss caused by these disasters. Third one is to contribute to the development and maintenance of a safe and sustainable community. We want a safe and sustainable community. And to have a safe and sustainable community, what we should ensure? We should ensure that if there is a disaster, then its impact on the society is minimal. That society can cope with the effect of that disaster by its own resources. If not, then by external aid. So we want that level of preparation for that community or the society through the disaster management. Now, what are the components of disaster management? There are 4 components of the disaster management. First one is preparedness. How prepared a society or a community is. by anticipating the disasters, or we anticipate the disasters by organizing steps before they occur. That any intervention, any activity, or any preparedness that is done before the occurrence of the disaster, that comes under the preparedness. We are trying to assess the vulnerability of the society. What is the vulnerability of the society? Then, based on that, measuring the vulnerability of society, what we need to enhance the capability of the society to cope with that disaster. What steps will be required? What resources will be required? What training will be required? All that comes under the preparedness. Mobilizing the resources, giving the training, building the infrastructure which can sustain the effect of that disaster, all that comes into the preparedness. Then second is mitigation. Mitigation is reducing the long-term risk of disasters on people and property. Means building capacity, building the capacity of the society or the community. So these are the two things which we do in pre-disaster phase: mitigation and preparedness. That building our infrastructure disaster resilient, that the effect of the disaster on the infrastructure is minimum. Increasing the capability or capacity of the community or the society to face the effects of the disaster, giving that all resources required, giving them that proper training, what they need to do during the disaster or after the disaster. So all such things comes under these two categories, basically the mitigation and the preparedness. Then third stage is response. Response is during the disaster. That how the society or a community or the people should respond to a disaster. What they are expected to do basically at the time of disaster. That comes under that response. Then next, or the fourth one, is recovery and rehabilitation. After the disaster has struck a particular society or community, then all steps taken to recover and rehabilitate that society or community comes under this point basically. Because after that disaster, we may need to help the society by providing them food, medicine, clothing, shelter. So it is all recovery. Then building back our infrastructure for the society, that is rehabilitation. So these are the four components of the disaster management. Now let us move to disaster management cycle. All these things which just I discussed basically, these are somehow part of that disaster management cycle. How we manage the disasters. So it's a cyclic process here. How this moves basically, we can classify that cycle into three stages: pre-disaster, during the disaster, and post-disaster. Here you see four arrows basically here. First one is mitigation, then preparedness, then response, then recovery. I just discussed with you in that components of disaster management. And as I told you, these two, mitigation and preparedness, these are in the pre-disaster phase, that is the before the occurrence of the event basically. Then here the event occurs, means that disaster strike. Then this is the during and post disaster phase basically, where response and recovery is there. So in the pre-disaster phase, what we do the things for capacity building, that we want to build the capacity of the society. We want to enhance the capability of the society to cope with or to face the disaster basically. And when that disaster occurs, during that disaster, that is during that emergency basically, how our community will behave, how our community will face that disaster, that is there in response. And after that, recovery and rehabilitation phase occurs in the post-disaster phase. So this is that way, this is the whole cycle. When we divide the total cycle, I am just repeating you that pre-disaster phase, during the disaster, and after the disaster or the post-disaster phase. Two things we do in pre-disaster phase, that is mitigation and preparedness. Then response is during that disaster, and recovery and rehabilitation is in the post-disaster phase basically. So this is the disaster management cycle. So as I discussed you, there are three stages in the disaster management cycle. Pre-disaster phase. This phase aims at reducing the potential losses that may incur to humans, environment and property. So here our all actions are aimed at reducing the impact of the disaster in terms of effect on human, environment and property. And second is, during the disaster, our aim is to meet the needs of the victims affected by the disaster. What the affected people, affected community wants at that time during the disaster. Providing all sort of help during that stage is all our activities that we are doing during the disaster. In the post-disaster phase, what we do is recovery and rehabilitation. That if there are some casualties, getting those bodies, giving help, making arrangements for the affected people, providing them shelter, temporary shelter, providing them or building back the infrastructure or property so that they can lead a peaceful life, or you can say sustainable life basically. So these are the three stages of the disaster management. Let us more elaborate these things. As I told you, in pre-disaster stage, mitigation is one of the important action basically. And this disaster mitigation refers to the measures that reduce the effect of a disaster. Whatever we do here is to reduce the impact of the disaster. These measures reduce the scale of impact of disasters by reducing vulnerable conditions. That how much vulnerability of the society or the community is there. We want to reduce that vulnerability by taking appropriate actions. Then this mitigation could be in the form of implementation of building bylaws. If we talk about that earthquake or flood events, then there will be framing of building bylaws, that what sort of building should be there, what norms should be followed when the buildings are being planned, designed and constructed. So these are the building bylaws. That in what type of soil the building should be constructed. If that area is earthquake prone or flood prone, then what sort of building should be designed, what materials should be used, what should be the technology to building to build these houses or construct these buildings. All sort of norms and bylaws that a government form basically. And not only form, the implementation of these bylaws. Because if we know that this area is earthquake prone and a large earthquake occurrence, large magnitude earthquake occurrence may be there, so government should make and enforce laws or bylaws through which the buildings constructed in that area are earthquake resistant. If it is a flood prone area, then the building should be flood resistant. So such bylaws should be formed and a strict implementation is ensured basically. So that is the part of the mitigation. Because when that earthquake occur, when some flood events occur, then these buildings are not affected. And if these buildings are not affected, then we can save the lives. That way. Then if habitation is in that coastal zone, then coastal zone regulations should be there. That from that from at a particular distance from the coastal area, the buildings can be constructed. What type of buildings may be constructed there? What should be the protective measures there in the coastal region for the buildings basically, like plantation of mangroves, such type of things basically. So all sort of things, all you can say regulatory framework through which we can regulate the construction and habitation of an area to make that society or community safe from the impacts of that disaster. That all such things comes under that mitigation basically. Then preparedness. This is also a pre-disaster stage. Under the preparedness, what we do, disaster preparedness involves readiness to respond quickly and appropriately when a disaster occurs. That there should not be any chaos. There should not be just a fear in the mind of the people that what they will do now. They should not be blank. There should be a proper training that if some disaster strikes in your area, then what you have to do, how you have to behave. Do not start running frantically. So whatever training is given to you, follow those instructions and behave according to those instructions during that disaster event. That is preparedness. Giving proper training. Giving training how to behave during an earthquake, what to do in case of flood, what to do in case of cyclone, such type of things, such type of trainings, mock drills, what to do in case of any fire. So many things. So all these activities that comes under the category of preparedness basically. This preparedness aims to prepare governments, organizations, communities and individuals to sufficiently anticipate and respond to disasters. This is the purpose basically. Risk of disasters is studied, and in conjunction with early warning systems, preparatory measures are taken. Some new technological advances are there. And in case of tsunami especially, in some cases in landslides also it has been tried. Early warning systems. That we get information in advance that there may be such type of disaster. So society has to be ready for that. Earlier, if you remember, there was widespread loss of life in case of cyclones. But now, due to the early prediction of that cyclones, how it will move, what will be the speed, at what time it may strike a particular region, then there are so many preparations are there. Evacuations are also there. People are moved or displaced from their location, possible affected location, to the safe locations. And because of that, now the impact of these cyclones is reduced to a minimum level because of that preparedness only, because of getting the information in advance. So this is the impact. This is the preparedness. That how this preparedness basically affect in a positive way basically. How it helps us, how it helps the communities to safeguard themselves in advance before some disaster attack them. It involves preparation of disaster preparedness plans, evacuation plans and emergency actions. In addition to that evacuation plans, what emergency actions are needed in such a case? All these things are thought in advance. All these things are planned in advance basically. This is preparedness. During a disaster, there is a sudden need of equipment and supplies. You need certain specialized equipments. If some loss to houses is there, some people are buried there, you need machines to just remove that debris and just take out those persons which are buried in that. So such requirement will be there. Some special equipments and that machines may be required there. Some supplies, food supplies, drug supplies, medicines, such things, clothes, these may be required in that area. And by knowing that this such type of disaster may occur or attack in that area, what we can do, we can plan in advance to stockpile, to make a stock of such things basically. If we know that after 2 days a particular area will be affected by cyclones and such type of damage will be there. There may be a uprooting of the trees, there may be breaking of that power lines, some poles of this power supply poles may fall. So we can plan in advance that we may need some special machines, cranes, JCBs, all these things we need to just recover for recovery and rehabilitation. So these may be may be kept ready and moved in advance to that area. Then all the agencies involved in rescue and recovery are given training and field exercises so as to respond to disasters in an appropriate manner. This is very important aspect, basically training. Training to that recovery agencies, training to that NGOs, training to the government officials, and training to the local people, local community, that how to behave, how to respond, what to do, all such things, that is comes under the preparedness basically. Then disaster stage, or means that during the disaster, what we have to do, that is the response. That how to respond, how the community will respond to the disaster. All such things, all such preparations that we do are under the disaster stage. Then in post-disaster stage, as I discussed you, the recovery and rehabilitation. We have to first of all look for the affected people, provide them whatever help is needed at that point of time, then making arrangement for their sustaining the life. All such activities, all such things comes under the post-disaster stage. So these are the three stages as I discussed you, that pre-disaster, during the disaster, and the post-disaster. What we do in each stage, that I discussed with you. What are disasters, how we manage the disasters, all these things I discussed with you. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion, and we will continue our discussion on more topics in this area in our next lectures. So thank you.